The Gabia's Justice by C. N. Rowan. There's an irony about how often the elements are used to kill those supposedly capable of controlling them. Water, fire, air, earth. Drowning, burning, hanging, burying them alive. Those so keen to use such tools to instill terror and keep the population silent, best hope they never capture a true, talented. Toulouse, Monday, the 7th of June, 1520. I hated the Gabia almost as much as I hated the Inquisition. And Philip de Bernouilli was also rapidly working his way up my list of hated things. The Gabia drew the eye most easily. Its curved metal bars were run through with red, corroded from their regular immersion into the Garonne. Tall enough to hold a man, albeit not comfortably, they suspended the device from the bridge that bore its name. Even the powerful who adhered most faithfully to the ways of the northern French still used its Occitan name. It was really nothing more fancy than a submersible gibbet. Those in charge of choosing who got to occupy the metal cage used the strange word to divorce themselves from the reality of its usage, while the choice of local dialect allowed its myth to grow and spread fear. Which is a long-winded way of saying that the rich and powerful are often bastards, and love to remind the poor of that fact. The representative of the Inquisition was easy to spot, dressed in the striking black robes that marked him as a member of the Dominican order, which was the most passionate in the hunting of heretics. He hugged his Latin Bible as tightly as his austere piety. I'd lost many a friend to the Dominicans' devices and pyres. If ever the talented had come close to open war, it was during this, the darkest of recent centuries. Still, throughout our expanded lifespans, we'd seen enough of how humanity reacted when afraid. None of us doubted how the talentless would respond to us. The miseries of the Inquisition would pale compared to all-out conflict, and mortals heavily outnumbered us. There was only so much that we could do about overwhelming odds, armed with cold, sharp steel. De Bernouilli hung back, hiding behind the authority of the Inquisitor, his sunken eyes alight with excitement that lingered behind his face's folds and jowls. He was corpulent, and famed for his interest in the corporal. Pleasure for him, punishment for any who stood against him. I'd heard his name on the wind, carried by scurrilous whispers around inn fires, underlined by dark glances thrown by workers unable to withstand him because he was the source of their pay. He owned the mill, and the work he provided supplied their crust. There were other mills, other jobs, but that was no solution for them. Even if they left de Bernouilli's mill, life would not improve. Labourers knew their place. Whilst the mill stood, the expectation was that they would work there. If it ground their bones up like wheat, who would care? It made me think of a folk story I'd heard recently up in Brittany of a boy who climbed a magic beanstalk and a giant who roared how he'd make bread of the bones of the men he found. If a worker got caught up in its brutal internal workings, the mill would do the same to him. I wondered what the girl had done to cause him offence. Condemnation and judgment might come from the priest, but prompting and payment to the priest's coffers came from de Bernouilli. Maybe she denied his advances or spoken out of turn. It was easy to speak out of turn when all the turns were his. His turn to speak, his mill wheel that turned, his greasing of the palms, turning the handle to send the Gabia down into the depths below. The girl looked remarkably composed, considering what was to come. There was little regular entertainment for the average Toulousan, apart from booze and back-breaking labour. So a hanging, a burning, or a drowning were moments to enjoy, from which to draw thin pleasure at not being in the poor wretch's place. Until you were. She knew what was coming. So why was she not crying or pleading? The good God knows I would have been, if I had been mortal and in her place. Whether she was exhibiting denial or self-control didn't matter. It wouldn't end well once they pushed her through the open cage door. I could have walked away. It wasn't my business. And after so many years away from Toulouse, away from France, this almost wasn't my town anymore. I chuckled out loud at that thought, and a few of the locals close to me pulled back to leave me space. Drawing attention to yourself prior to the passing of judgment could be suicidal. I chuckled again, louder this time, enough to cause a falter in the Inquisitor's speech. All his attention had been on the poor lass, but now he looked querulously at me as I sauntered closer. "Have you something to add to the accounting, man, that you do disturb our holy work?" He peered down his nose at me, trying to judge if I was a supporter or a sinner. I was happy to clarify the matter, only to ask whether you've considered carrying out your mission closer to home. I continued to smile and to walk towards him. The crowd, their sense of self-preservation well honed, parted around me in case my audacity might contaminate them. My question took aback the robed priest. "Do you suspect heresy in Albi? If so, there is a time to present your concerns. Let us deal with the most pressing matters presented, and then we can extract all information concerning your knowledge of heretics." I knew how he meant to extract it. I mean, in the Vatican itself. Not that it causes me any concern, but you have such rigid ideas about what is right and wrong. Perhaps if you still consider homosexuality a crime, you should talk to the Holy Father, Leo X himself. The gasp that ripped through the crowd was as loud as it was satisfying. I knew I was showing off, but I was enjoying the moment. I knew I would not enjoy what came next, so I'd take what I could now. The Dominican's face turned white as he sputtered. What? What? How dare you slander the Pope in such a manner, villain? I shrugged nonchalantly. No slander here, Father. I just came back from the Holy City where he propositioned me directly. Sadly, he wasn't to my liking. I do not appreciate hypocrites who allow such acts as you commit while indulging in their own pleasures. So I turned him down. Does that answer your question? The man had turned a rage-driven red so dark his pallor was within shades of his black Dominican robes. The surrounding guards, used to waiting for orders, were sharp enough to pick up what he wanted, even though he was too apoplectic to say a word. By the time he began screaming for my arrest, most of the guards had already started forward. The fury in his tone spurred the last of them on, and they rushed down the steps. Which was just what I had hoped for, because it left the girl alone. I avoided looking at her directly, but out of the corner of my eye I was relieved to see someone dart from the crowd and draw her away to safety. My plan had worked. She would not drown, although I would instead. Marvellous. I was quickly condemned to death, since there was no doubting my guilt. I had shouted it to the rooftops for all to hear. They placed me in the Gabia in record time, and the priest was practically frothing at the mouth in anticipation of my demise. This would be no illusion of a dunking. They were sending me down to drown. Throughout it all, I kept my eyes fixed on Philippe de Bernouillet. There was little I could do against the Inquisition. Picking off a priest here or there simply led to terrible retribution against an innocent populace. And the talented weren't ready to go to war with the whole might of the Catholic Church. De Bernouillet, though, was a local who was channeling those forces against my people for his own aims. Control. That, and petty revenge when slighted. My gaze never wavered from his, not even as they forced me into the Gabia, hunched up, my hands gripping cold bars as they closed the gate. Not as he stepped forward to release the lever. His hands trembled as he wrapped his meaty digits around it. He could feel the weight of my regard, of my anger. I'll be seeing you soon. My words were gentle enough to be kept from the ears of the priest, who was now ranting to the assembled masses about the wages of sin. Still, the potent fury of them meant they reached their intended target. De Bernouillet scoffed. "You'll be seeing none but the other drowned wretches afore the devil himself, man." He was right on the first part. as he pushed the lever forward and the heavy gear clanked into place with effort. I repeated myself. I'll be seeing you soon. Then I was gone, down to feed the fishes, and all those who swam in the Garonne's hidden depths. De Bernoy headed back to his vaunted mansion next to the mill. He wasn't a man to build his home away from his business. He always wanted oversight. His lack of trust in others was a projection of his own character traits onto them. He filled his gullet with fine food and wines. No doubt he was already planning how he would reorient the Inquisitor towards his chosen target before he left for fresh pastures upon which to build a cleansing pyre. Or, perhaps, de Bernoy considered his chances of persuading the girl to his way of thinking had improved now that she had stood so close to death. Doubtless he found pleasure, even excitement, in such a thought. After indulging his appetite and dreaming of indulging others, he dismissed the servants and retired by candlelight to his opulent, oversized bed. Wrapped in Lyonnese silks on a reinforced oak frame, he was carried away to pleasant dreams of death and desires. He slept like a baby after killing a stranger. His awakening was less pleasant. There was a glowing candle near to his face. His eyes opened blearily, fixing instinctively on the source of light that was ruining his night vision and making it impossible to identify who was holding it. "Who's there?" There was fear in his voice, albeit tempered with arrogance. He assumed servitude. He feared retribution, and his fear was justified. I leant forward and pulled the candle back to illuminate my features. De Bernoy shrank back, whiter than his finely woven sheets. The problem with pointing fingers at people to accuse them of heresy, such as magic, is that you might end up being correct. My smile was almost kindly, a schoolmaster explaining to an errant pupil. I felt him try to spring from his bed to flee in terror from what he assumed must be a vengeful apparition. He could not see the bands of talent I had wrapped around him. Elemental work was never my forte, but I had more than enough to deal with the likes of him. Illusions were my specialty. I leant forward and helped him gently to his feet, where he stood, unmoving. I led him through the darkened house. We passed footsore servants finishing off scraps of meat and wine whilst cursing their callous master. They never noticed him, begging and pleading as he passed them by. De Bernoy was a phantom, invisible to all but me or another of the talented, and I doubted any of them would ride to his rescue. The outside air mirrored us, cloaking us in breeze-borne mist, much as I did in magic. The mill loomed up out of the obfuscating haze. It took little more than a wave of the hand to have the gate creak open and allow us entry. The mill sat astride the Garonne, the tributary that branched off before it looped back to rejoin the Garonne and form the Ile of Tunis. It was the very place where de Bernouilli had planned a watery grave for a brave woman. The building protruded into the waters, its water wheel gripping tight to its side, transmutating the waves into a grinding force. I took him to stand at the open deck, where the tide lapped just below the water-stained wooden ledge. Normally it was crowded with tied-up boats and barges ready to ferry raw supplies and refined produce in and out. Tonight, in their place, stood the Gabia. De Bernouilli quivered when he saw it, and I could understand why. The normal Gabia was terrifying enough, and he'd seen it in action often enough. Hell, he'd put it into action often enough. This was twice the size of the one he had forced me into. "Don't worry," I murmured in his ear as I forced him forward. "You'll not be going down alone." I pushed him in, then followed, snapping the door shut behind us. I turned him to face me, unable to move, unable to look away. His terror was writ large across his well-indulged features. "Allow me to tell you a story," I said. I snapped my fingers, and a clank echoed in the dark. The Gabia moved slowly down towards the water. Magic exists, though by now I doubt that is news to you. Those of us who know about it call it talent, and we call ourselves the talented. We have different amounts of talent, and not everyone is aware of what they have, especially those with little chance in life. Who can explore a talent, even a talent, when life is constantly tickling their half-starved ribs with a knife? Not something you would know much about, eh? I gave him a friendly wink as we descended and passed into the Garonne. De Bernouilli's burbling cries and denials turned to gasps of amazement. He had expected to drown, yet he was still breathing. There was air in the Gabia. The water stopped at the bars. "Still," I carried on, still smiling at him as we descended deeper, "death is a powerful motivator. A girl sent down in the Gabia, young and lovely and innocent, terrified and tearful, was heading to a watery end for daring to say no to those above her station. Not the poor lass from this evening, though you aimed for just such an ending for her as well. This girl wielded a talent that could have made her a force to be reckoned with had her life not been cut short. Perhaps she carried a touch of the Fae about her, although I think it is more likely that her connection to the water, a fascination throughout her life, bubbled up as she went tumbling down. It forced her talent to reshape her. A dark, moving shadow circled the cage, and I saw de Bernouilli's eyes flicker back and forth, following the movement. The opacity of a river festooned with cast-off waste made the shape difficult to identify. At times it looked as if it had an arm, at others a long, powerful tail. Nothing was clear until claws that might once have been fingers, the same colour as the calico sacks scattered on the floor of the deck above, wrapped around the bars. A face followed, almost human save for feathery, knife gashed gills visible at the neck and a mouthful of razor-like teeth that gaped and snapped at a barrier the whimpering mill owner couldn't see. I wasn't surprised by the acrid smell of urine. I could condemn de Bernoy for a lot of things, but not that. I'd have lost control in his place too, but that didn't mean I didn't enjoy his suffering. I've released my control of him enough to allow him a small amount of movement. When they pulled the Gabia back up, the assumption was that they had done a poor job of securing the door. Either way, she was gone. What did it bother them if they had a body to show or not? Tell me, how many times has the Gabia come back up empty since? The squeal de Bernoy gave would not have been amiss in the San Cyprian slaughterhouses. I'd created a small gap in the protective barrier. It kept out the water, but not the exploration of a probing webbed hand, the fingertips of which were more like knives than nails. A quick grasp tore a generous stake from his behind. De Bernoy practically leapt into my arms, stumbling into me as hands wrapped around the bars behind him. Another face, more disturbing for looking almost human, peered between them and bared its broken blade teeth. The once woman swallowed her pound of flesh greedily, her gullet distended. Droplets of blood, like spilt claret, floated around her, suspended in the water. Her darting tongue flicked out to sweep them up. There's a power in desperation, a prayer made of despair, I continued. That talented once woman, now reshaped to swim in waters that welcomed her when the world never did, heard those prayers sometimes. The prayers of those sent down to drown. The last fractured thoughts, the air clutched in, the water pressing from without. Perhaps she saw herself in them, in the taste of fear laced with fury at the injustice of dry land that carried on the water's currents. Whatever the reason, sometimes she brought the drowning in to join her. Sometimes she and her clan ate their bones down to the marrow. I shrugged, nonchalantly. Who am I to judge? I waved my hand, and the Gabia headed upwards. The claws snatched away, and the mouth hissed silent outrage. I muttered apologies, but I didn't feel too guilty. I'd fed them the body I had worn the previous day, so they couldn't be that hungry. De Bernoy wept, pawed at my clothes, thanked me over and over again. He thought I had shown him mercy. There's no fool like a desperate fool, and none more confident of their fate than those who have always been able to buy the future they wished for. We surfaced at the dock once more. I carried out the trembling man and gently sat him on the sawdust-strewn planks. The Gabia vanished, leaving us looking out over the dark expanses of the Garanet. The dock sat in the middle of the water, the two shores equidistant, mere metres away. I squatted on my haunches, so I could look de Bernoy in the eyes. In a moment, I'm walking out of here. I nodded towards the only exit from the mill. When I do, I'm going to burn this place to the ground. I made a flame appear in my hand. Elemental magic isn't my forte, but that didn't mean I couldn't use it when I needed to. De Bernoy started whimpering again, bargaining and pleading. I shushed him. I'm not interested in your offers. This place is done. The question is, what will you do? I stood up and looked around. I'll seal the door so there's no escape that way, but there's a few options available to you. On the side of the empty storeroom attached to the dock, a spade leant against the timber wall. I walked over, picked it up and inspected it. If you dig in this corner, you might hit earth. Maybe you can dig your way out that way. Though there's a good chance you'll suffocate from the smoke long before you get through. If it doesn't cave in and bury you alive, of course. I looked up at the boom that jutted over the water to allow goods to be hoisted in and out of the boats. I suppose you could take some of this rope and shimmy up it if you wanted to take the easy way out. Although I don't think you're the sort to give up hope entirely, are you? As he gibbered and wept, I went back to him and stared out across the murky waters. Or you could swim for it. The shore isn't far. You might make it. Do you think you can swim there faster than them down below the surface can find you? I pointed at the door, the spade, the boom, and the water. Fire, earth, air, water. Take your pick. If you survive, you're a free man. If not, I'll be watching your heirs, and I'll be happy to have this conversation with them, if needs be. I patted de Bernoy's cheek, a friendly parting gesture, then headed for the door. I'd offered him 4 options. 3 more than he had offered to those who denied his will. I smiled. He had just as much chance of escape as they'd had. The door out of the storeroom slammed shut, cutting off his garbled demands and denials. The barrel of lamp oil I'd stashed outside of it was still there, and I sloshed it about as I walked out of the mill. I wanted to get myself into position on the shore to watch him. My money was on him risking the swim. I wanted to stand witness to justice being served. Note: the Moulin de Château Mill suffered a series of floods and fires over the following centuries, before finally being abandoned in 1945. The local government filled in the Garonne and turned it into a thoroughfare to guide traffic away from the Garonne. It flooded so regularly that the city council built enormous steel doors that snapped shut to replace the sandbags they threw down to save lives when the waters rose. The modern world has always been so eager to deny the fury of the elements. It rarely works. Not for long, at least. The end. You have been listening to The Gabia's Justice by C. N. Rowan. Read by myself, C. N. Rowan. A short story from the world of the imperfect Cathar. Book 1 of the imperfect Cathar, called Imperfect Magic, will be available from May 2023. You can follow me for more information at my website www.cnrowan.com.